comes the sun. Here comes the sun. I say.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Carter, Executive Director at Livermore Valley Arts at the Bankhead Theater. And today I am talking to Michael Collopy, a photographer who will be here with our Ray to Rose speaker series on Thursday, May 11th at 7:30 p.m. And if you're interested in getting tickets, you can go online at livermorearts.org. So, Michael, I'm Chris. We've emailed before.
Yes.
And
Nice to meet you over the internet, Chris.
yeah, at least, yeah, get a face to the name. Or is that right? A face to the name to the face?
That's right.
And then Ruth is our Director of Marketing.
Ruth, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for doing this. I think
Of course, happy to.
I was putting together, some marketing materials and the event page and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, wait, this guy has taken some of the most famous photographs ever. And he lives right here in the Bay Area. And
Oh, well, thanks.
He's going to be on our stage, and it's like, wow, this will be very interesting. And I instantly recognized, obviously, the Mother Teresa one and the Dalai Lama and stuff. And it's just like fascinating to see all of that. And so really cool.
Thank you.
Really cool. So
excellent.
It's a pleasure to put a name and a face to the person behind the camera.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's been a lot of fun through the years for sure.
I've been to your website several times now as getting ready for this, and I kind of have a hard time believing that you took all those pictures. So I'm looking at it and I see Mother Teresa, I see the Dalai Lama, Jane Goodall, Jimmy Carter. When I was a kid, I used to tell other kids Jimmy Carter was my grandfather, by the way. That was just because we shared the same last name. Gloria Steinem, Willie Nelson, Ella Fitzgerald. I mean, the list goes on and on. And I just need to know who was the first person, public figure, that you photographed, and how did you really get started with this career?
Well, I think in terms of what you just said there, that only makes me old, Chris. I've been photographing for about 45 years, and how I got started, I actually was thinking that I would go in the direction of my parents. Both of my parents were artists, grew up in a big family, 6 of us. And I thought that I would follow in the direction of my dad, who was a graphic designer. I ended up going to various schools, the Academy of Art, College of San Mateo, College of Notre Dame, and then I finally graduated over at St. Mary's College with a fine art degree. Looked for a job that was graphic design oriented, but in those years prior to the computer age, all that was available to a young art graduate, was something that's called a paste up person that would paste up different kinds of advertisements for design firms. And, the jobs that were available to me at that time, Chris, were not really creative jobs. So I was pretty discontented that here I went through all that schooling and, never came away with something that was really creative as a career or occupation. And so it was around that time that I saw an exhibit of Ansel Adams' work at the Oakland Museum. And I had never taken photography in school. I'd always loved photography, and somebody had given me a Brownie camera when I was in high school. So I would tool around with that and take, sunset pictures at Folsom Lake and those type of things on our camping trips. But I never really looked at it as a serious profession. However, having seen the Ansel Adams exhibit, I remember talking to one of the docents there at the museum who said that Ansel had a house in Carmel, and that's where he lived. That's where his darkroom was. And so the next day I called 411 information up for a listing on Ansel Adams. And sure enough, he was listed. I called, he answered the phone, and I told him that I was interested in photography. And he said, well, that's great. I oftentimes meet with young photographers on Wednesday nights for a glass of wine, and we watch the sunset and talk for a little bit. So that's really how I got into photography, was learning from Ansel Adams. And I befriended him and would go down quite often over the course of about 3 or 4 years and work with him in his dark room and talk to him about a variety of things in regard to photography that really stick with me today. So that's really how I got started. I realized that I could never make a living making environmental pictures on the scale that Ansel Adams was doing. So
Yeah.
I had always been interested in people. I used to draw and graphically design individuals of note, most often out of great photographs. So I was aware of some of the photographers that had taken those pictures, but I was more interested in graphically kind of designing these images. And so the other person that I thought would be very instrumental in my career was Richard Avedon. So I saved my money up and I went to New York, and I went to his studio, I think every day for about 2 weeks prior to the opportunity of being able to meet with him face to face via his studio manager. And that was really the epiphany moment that I came back with, Chris, that really gave me the inspiration to pursue this career as a photographer, as mostly a portrait photographer in those years. And the first, let me think who would be the first individual of note. Well, in terms of a world leader, it probably was Mikhail Gorbachev. I was one of the first photographers that had been able to do a portrait photograph of he and Raisa Gorbachev. When
What year would have that been?
That would have been I would say it would have been in the early 80s, early to mid 80s. And prior to that, I guess my big break was meeting Frank Sinatra as a 20-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working in a theater, much like the Bankhead Theater. It was a little bit bigger, perhaps. And I ended up photographing a lot of their entertainers. I was their house photographer for about 10 years. And one of the individuals that came to perform was Frank Sinatra. And I ended up doing a few pictures of him that he liked. And then a few years later, he hired me to do some of his photography for about 8 to 9 years after that.
I can't believe the first question I ask you, the names that come out are Ansel Adams, Frank Sinatra, Mikhail Gorbachev. It sounds like though it's not just right place, right time, but you really made an effort to go out there and meet these people.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I think it's very important. I think in those years, I was very much fired up to meet individuals that I thought could be an inspiration and bring me further into this career or a little bit down the vocational path.
Yeah.
And I say that only because I think there's a lot of us who want to pursue a particular career. And, it's all a matter of just reaching out and connecting with somebody that perhaps you admire in your life, in your same vocational career path. And more often than not, I think people are willing to meet with you for coffee or for a short meeting. For those that won't meet with you, certainly there will be some that will. And it could be one of those individuals that would, incite that inspiration that you would need for that vocational discernment.
That's such great advice. Does anybody, are you that person for other people now? Or
I really try to be, Chris, because, I came up that way. And I think whenever I'm asked to speak or whenever some young photographer calls me, I'm always available and want to be there for them in the same way that Ansel and Richard Avedon were for me.
Yeah. And Michael, I just think so many of those figures that you've photographed over the years, you've got to have a few that are really memorable for you. Is there one or two that just really stand out? I mean, yeah, I wouldn't know where to start if I was you, but I mean, if you could pick like one that you were absolutely would do over again in a heartbeat, who would it be?
Well, there have been so many, as you said, I've been blessed in my life, I think, to meet most of my heroes growing up. I had a great affinity to individuals who are changing the world, as well as it was for individuals who maybe influenced me with music or could be politics or, entertainers, artists. I would say that, there were a number. If one was to come out at me as probably my favorite, was probably Mother Teresa, because I had seen a movie about her life prior to her being world famous, and that really influenced me. to get to know her and to have that opportunity to meet her and photograph her. But I would also say, growing up in the 60s, Chris, I was very influenced by the Beatles. And I think the opportunity that I had later in life to meet Paul McCartney and get to know him and Ringo Starr, that was really a wonderful experience. And sometimes, when you meet your heroes, they can be a letdown in some way.
Yeah.
But certainly these are two individuals that are very, very humble people and, not caught up with their fame, not presumptuous, and, take time to talk with you and get to know you. And I've gotten to know Paul and his family as I first met his brother, and then I got to work with Paul. And now I keep pretty often contact with his oldest daughter, Mary, who is a photographer as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, those individuals stand out. I think I was very much involved with loving the Apollo program and NASA as a young kid, and having been able to meet and photograph a lot of those NASA astronauts, such as Neil Armstrong and John Glenn and Jim Lovell. That was really extraordinary experiences as well in my life.
Yeah. I see Ruth has her hand up, so I'm wondering if she has a question.
The question I have is sort of the opposite of what Chris just asked you. Is there anybody that you would really like to photograph that you haven't been able to find your way in to get that sitting with them?
Oh, that's a great question.
Ruth, I think that's always a question that I grapple with, because definitely there are so many. I have a sense of a curiosity about certain individuals and an admiration, of course. And I've always sought in my career to document individuals who were of note, of accomplishment in some way. And that's probably a long list, going back to the fact that I wish I was a little younger, or a little bit actually older, in the 60s, to have been able to document some of those wonderful bands that were playing in those years. And, maybe the thought of photographing Robert Kennedy as a 10-year-old, I got a chance to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
And with my family, my parents were big supporters of his run for presidency. So that was a big inspiration as a young 10-year-old. And it probably prompted me to document these individuals of note going forward, because 2 months after I met Robert Kennedy with my parents, he was assassinated. And I realized that this was an individual who was changing the world, and selfless service really to other people, and especially the poor and those who are marginalized. So I think that made a big impression on me, that whatever I ended up choosing in my career, I would try to give back in some way to the community. But to answer your question, there's a number of people. I'm working on a book, Ruth, called The Influencers, which is a book about musicians that have influenced other musicians. And I would love to get, for example, somebody like Keith Richards to probably do the forward, because he's sort of a side man that, had influenced generations of artists. I started out documenting a lot of the rock and roll foundation, people like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, Fats Domino. And of course, all of those individuals would be documented in this book, but I would love to bring it up to date in terms of the young artists that are out there today who were influenced by that second tier of musicians, such as the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and others. So, in my career, I've been blessed to have photographed a lot of different genres of music. So to be able to put a lot of those influences in one book and to try to go forward, it's going to really incite me to try to go after a lot of these artists of today and people who slipped through the cracks who I wasn't able to get a portrait of. So that would be pretty high on my list. The other thing, Ruth, is I've spent a lot of years documenting the Nobel Peace Laureates, and I'm up to 41 Nobel Peace Laureates that I've photographed. And there are a couple. There's one individual who received the Nobel Peace Prize in I think it was 22, and or maybe it was 21 that he received it with Maria Ressa, the two journalists. So this man is a journalist from Russia who I'd like to document. So just to keep up with that particular archive. But long story short, I could think of so many different people, artists, entertainers, actors, musicians that I would love to photograph. There's never a shortage of that.
Yeah, thank you. And you have this nonprofit that you've started too, Architects of Peace. Is that correct?
Yes, Chris.
And tell me a little bit more about that and how that came about. And you have a book also.
I do. I do. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's really at the forefront of what I'm doing today. So I realized that after photographing a lot of these Nobel Peace Laureates and spending time with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, individuals that we really put up there on a pedestal in some ways as our world peacemakers. Although I'd have to say they don't see themselves in that light. They don't see themselves in any way being on a pedestal, but they have been very much influencers in our world for the good. And I would say that after having a lot of these individuals, I put them into a book right before the millennium called Architects of Peace. And so I reached out to the Dalai Lama, at the time, Gorbachev, Nelson Mandela, individuals such as Spielberg and Carlos Santana, a real wide cultural view of our world in 1999. And I asked each of these 75 individuals to write a statement on the issue of peace. And that was something that just sort of took off and had a life of its own. Maybe I think I was really kind of thinking that if I didn't get too far, I would have to fold the cards on it. But after 6 months, I had a number of these individuals wanting to participate. And I really spent maybe 5 years on the road documenting these people around the world. I think one year I logged in 250,000 travel miles, air miles, photographing them. So I was very happy that they took the time in a free way, unpaid, to write a statement about peace. And I realized that having all of these individuals together under one book roof, that I should bring this out to the schools. So that's been my journey ever since that time, to be able to bring these individuals. And I haven't stopped photographing the latest peacemakers that arise in our world and document them, to bring them out to the schools so that students everywhere can get an opportunity to learn from these individuals, from the examples of their lives. So we oftentimes have exhibits in the schools, and we have educational curriculum that's tied in with these individuals at places like Stanford and Marquette, the National Civil Rights Museum, various schools in the Bay Area and across the US and in Mexico. And so, it's been really gratifying to see that this work and these images and the statements of peace that are associated with the picture in various exhibits outside the classrooms in these schools, that it has influenced students. It kind of dictates their day a little bit. And having a word like kindness or compassion or acceptance, there's certain words and quotes that I think can really influence us, especially if we see them on a daily basis. And we've been told with the professors at various universities where these images and quotes lie, that it has helped the students kind of navigate their personal relationships on a daily basis. And it also has helped them to discern their vocation, in their life. And it all really ties back to the fact that I think, first, of that quote by Gandhi, that if you really want to find yourself, you should lose yourself in the service of other people. So I think ultimately our goal with Architects of Peace is to not only raise the bar and kind of bring these individuals into these homes of these students and have them learn from them, but also to realize that probably the greatest fulfillment that they'll ever get in life is to be able to spend time working in their community, spend time in service to others.
Wow. Well, maybe that's something we can work on with you out here in Livermore. So just
I would love it.
Put that in your pocket for the future.
I would love to be involved.
Yeah. And you do have some photographs that are going to be on exhibit here. We do have a gallery, and we've been working with you on a musical exhibit around art and rock and roll. And you photographed a lot of great musicians over the years too. So is there anything you want to share about what
Sure.
we'll have here?
Well, I'm honored that Anne and you had asked me to, bring some images. So I printed up some images of the people that I really had great times with and admired through the years. One being John Lee Hooker. So John Lee Hooker, when you think of his importance in music, he wrote some songs back in the late 1940s that really were a precursor to rock and roll. And when you ask, say, Keith Richards or Mick Jagger or Paul McCartney or Eric Clapton, they'll always cite John Lee Hooker as being a great influence of theirs. So I have an image of John Lee Hooker. I have B.B. King, who was just this wonderful man who was also quite an influence on rock and roll. I have Greg Allman, and I also have Buddy Guy. And Buddy Guy may not be a household name for a lot of people, but, Buddy was a greatly admired and considered to be a mentor for Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, and a host of others.
Yeah.
So those are the individuals that, and Carlos Santana, I think I'm bringing as well. So many of those particular individuals, I had a relationship, a friendly relationship over many, many years. Carlos, I still see and work with, and that's going on 45 years. And John Lee Hooker, I knew very, very well for many years, as Buddy Guy and Greg Allman, Greg is unfortunately gone.
Yeah, well, we're certainly excited to have those photos here. So thank you for being a part of that. I do have to mention we're both St. Mary's alums. So
fantastic.
I don't know if you see right there.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic, Chris.
So
I knew we were brothers.
Yeah, I knew a couple
great.
brothers. So I feel like I have a connection to you already.
Definitely.
I had one other question I was going to ask you, maybe two, but you've been doing this, you said, for 45 years. How has technology kind of changed your profession? Are you using digital, or have you moved on to digital photography? Or are you still kind of doing it the old-fashioned way, or is it, I don't know, is it, do you take pictures with your iPhone ever? I mean, I don't know, like, what's your, how it's so different nowadays with photography than it used to be, and it's so prolific in a lot of in our lives now. What's your, have you changed at all, or have you kind of really focused on the way you've always done it?
Well, thanks for asking that, Chris. And absolutely, I've changed through the years. It's extraordinary when you think of the trajectory of photography in the course of a few decades, how we started out with analog and now we're into some incredible digital cameras. So I remember in the years where I was friendly with Ansel Adams and would talk with him about photography, and he said to me one day, he said, I wish I was about your age, because you're gonna see the advent of digital photography. And he got into it a little bit, and certainly he knew in the early 1980s, and I want to say like 1980, 1981, that this was all going to go digital. And he must have had some sort of insight in regard to where it was going to all go. But when it did start going digital, I immediately went into it, Chris. And maybe that wasn't the best thing, because those early digital cameras were very, very expensive and probably not far off of what the local, what our iPhones can do right now, the capacity that an iPhone has. And they were very expensive. But at that time, I always wanted to stay up on the latest technology. So when we were working in analog, it was quite expensive for us young photographers. We really weren't seeing a huge income because Polaroids were so expensive, and film development was so expensive, and printing, of course, was expensive. So, it was all, adding up after a while. And, if you shot, for example, 4x5 or 8x10, you'd go through a box of Polaroids that were about $100 a piece. And we'd go through that maybe in a half a day. So, that was complicated, to really see, the fruits of your efforts in regard to pay. And of course, I stayed up. I think, I shot so much in the early years in black and white. I always wanted to find the best film to use. And I started out working with Plus X and Tri-X, which were still, even to this day, good films. However, I was always a big fan doing portraits of having the best quality and the best, detail. And I was looking for very little grain in those films. So I went to T-Max as soon as that came on the market and exhausted those particular films and tried to, if I was studio lighting somebody, I would want to shoot with a very low ISO. So I oftentimes bought the 100 T-Max film, I guess it was in those days, medium format, because in those shoots I was using a Hasselblad. But as soon as it went digital, I immediately went into digital and, tried to stay up on the latest cameras. I'm just about to get an R5 Canon camera, and I've gone back and forth from Nikon to Canon. And, as a question exists oftentimes as to what is the best camera, I think it's really what you can do with any camera. And, having said that, when I'm on vacation or if I'm in the mountains or hiking, I'll just use the iPhone. And you can really get a pretty decent print off of the iPhone. I've found that it's all about the apps. I ended up doing a shoot not long ago with Steve Wozniak, and he told me that the great invention wasn't the iPhone as much as it was all the applications. And I tend to agree with them because, there's certain apps that I can recommend for photographers who photograph with their iPhone. One is called Snapseed. And Snapseed is a wonderful app that's free, and you can manipulate your photographs. You can send pictures from your camera or just use the app with your phone pictures, and you can make them more dramatic. You can make them artsy. You can change the color. You can turn them into black and white. There's so many different avenues with Snapseed that you can utilize on that. So it's almost like another Photoshop that's basically free to anybody who's got a phone.
Wow, thank you.
Sure.
Last question. When you are here on May 11th, what can we expect to hear from you?
Well, what I'll do is I'll bring a lot of photographs. And, having had a lot of portrait sessions, the big gratifying thing that I've had in my career, Chris, was all the relationships that I've had through the years with many of these individuals of note. And I will probably, go through a litany of stories and experiences of these individuals. And I have a lot to talk about and a lot of pictures to show from way back at my earliest career, start to probably weeks before the the actual talk. I'll bring pictures and basically tell stories and talk a little bit about the process, but mostly it's going to be stories of these individuals that I've gotten to know through the years that made such an impact in my life.
Well, we are looking forward to it on May 11th, Thursday at 7:30. If anybody's interested in purchasing a ticket, you can go to livermorearts.org and come see Michael Collopy and some of his great photos. And we're really looking forward to it. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ruth.